Well, normally it's a switch. Now I got to remember the button too, so I'm really failing this morning. Well, it's been a good morning already at the Cherry Blossom Festival with the prayer breakfast. I hope that you all enjoyed listening to Cheryl Rogers Barnett. And I'm very interested in this panel. And you know, I have to pop in and out all the time during the festival, so I always enjoy watching the videos later. But I know this is going to be a fascinating panel about presidential inaugurations. How many of you have watched the inaugurations in your lifetime? You know, my family, we had the opportunity to attend a presidential inauguration and about froze to death, caught pneumonia. It was all kind of an excitement. But I remember a statement being made by an individual who happened to be next to me in the audience. And she was from a foreign country, and her embassy had arranged for her to attend. She said, "It's magnificent to me to realize that in my country, when we switch hands of power, there's usually a civil war or someone loses their life, and we have quite a controversy." And this happened to be at a time when our nation was going through such a thing it was the inauguration of George W. Bush. And she said, even in your country during times of great controversy, it amazes me how all of those in power can assemble together and switch the hands of power and do so smoothly. And we've seen times through presidential inaugurations that have been kind of exciting, and we've seen times where presidents didn't always get along. We've seen frosty relationships with first ladies, and these individuals on the panel today will bring all that to life in a historical perspective. And it was only natural to ask George Cleveland, the grandson of President Grover Cleveland, to be our moderator this morning. So without further ado, if you'd welcome George, our moderator, who will introduce the panel.
I got my own. Thank you, Nicholas. Is that working all right? Can you all hear me? Nicholas asked, how many of you have ever watched one? How many of you have ever been to an inauguration? Good, that's good. That's not bad at all. Pomp and circumstance, ruffles and flourishes. How can you go wrong at an inauguration, whether you like the people coming in or not? I've been to two of them. I went to Clinton's first, and I went to Obama's first. And all of which are, amazing tales in and of themselves, although the main thing I remember from Obama's was the largest line of porta potties I've ever seen in my entire life, anywhere on the entire planet. It's an amazing thing to witness, regardless of what your political view is. It is about one of the fanciest events that we as a country can put together. And there's also, I just want to tell you before I forget, there seems to have been an odd thing that has cropped up in them, that there's a point at which the former president, when the just incoming president and the outgoing presidents go and they say goodbye, and the outgoing president gets into the helicopter, and he and the first ladies fly around the crowd. And both times I've went, the crowd has spontaneously broken into a chorus of na 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 na, hey hey, goodbye. Hundreds of thousands of people doing that. Our guests today, just the blue ribbon panel of historical writers and historians and people who have a passion for all things history. Louis Picone, who is his third book has just come out, as you may have heard, and you will shortly later. Right. Louis and I are, he is on the board of the Grover Cleveland Birthplace Association, which I'm an associate member. Larry Cook, you've heard from. Larry he's like a little kid. He goes, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and look, and here I've got the picture to prove it.
And it was so cool.
Right, and it was great. And yeah, I've got a picture of him from the other day. He looks like he's dancing with his book. It's great. And Mary Achor, just one of the sweetest people in the whole wide world. And I've known her, I think, just about since the beginning of Cherry Blossom era. Mary has her hand in many, many books, and her contacts of, I had coffee with Ron Paul and his wife at a New Hampshire primary a few years back. Ron Paul is a great fan of my grandfather's, and I remember Carol Paul, she gave me her cookbook, a copy of her cookbook with the recipe for chocolate chip cookies. She says is what won her husband's heart. So I haven't made them yet, which may explain a lot. Anyway, Louis, why don't we go, you recently wrote a fascinating paper that I wrote about that tells us something we may not all know, and you can kind of lead us into the first time our country ever witnessed this. And I would say that was, for George Washington, the first president of the United States, but that's not completely true.
Yeah. So trivia question, who was the first president of the United States? I guess so it's not George Washington, it would be this man here, John Hanson. So John Hanson was the first president under the Articles of Confederation. And his title was President of the United States and Congress Assembled. And on November 5th, 1781, John Hanson took the oath of office as the first president. So this was before the Constitution, before there was any thoughts of a president that would serve 4 years. So John Hanson's term was only 1 year, and he took the oath of office with no fanfare or anything. It just seemed like another item on Congress's agenda that day. But George Washington, in many letters that he would send him, would address him as President Hanson. And several weeks later, George Washington, who was still fighting the Revolutionary War, would write him, and he said, "I congratulate Your Excellency on your appointment to fill the most important seat in the United States." So this is a little bit of trivia maybe, but some people like to think that there was 8 presidents before George Washington, and there's actually a real interesting interview with Prince from the Tavis Smiley show where he pontificates about the 8 presidents before George Washington. So
You never know where you're going to find a history fan. See, Larry, we're all used to seeing people freezing to death at the inaugurations. I know one of the coldest I ever was in my life was at Obama's inauguration. Now, once upon a time, it used to be in slightly balmier weather, and fittingly, the only day of the year that makes a play on words, March 4th, used to be the inauguration day. But then they decided to put it back into the Siberian times. How did that come about?
Well, to go back a little further, the very first inauguration with George Washington in 1789, that was actually on April 30th. So the dates changed a couple of times. And then they went to March 4th for the inauguration day. And that really, a lot of people don't realize that, but that really went up into kind of recent times. The last March 4th inauguration was the 1933 inauguration for FDR. And I see a lot of expressions like people didn't realize that. And then the first January 20th one was 1937, 4 years later. So FDR, he got to make a lot of history because he had 4 inaugurations, but he really made history in those two, having the last March 4th and the first January 20th. And people will say, well, why did they change that date? And it's really pretty obvious when somebody tells you, you're like, oh yeah, because technology changed, so the votes could get counted faster. People could get to DC faster with technology, ride from Harrisburg to DC on a horse versus in a car, a little bit of difference. So they decided they didn't need all that time. Now, after the last couple of elections, with how long it took to count the votes, we may go back to March, I don't know. But it was the logistics of getting people to the inauguration and the vote counting that made it change. But I like the expressions there because most people don't realize it was as recent as the 1930s that we were having March inaugurations.
Any of you, why did we decide to have an inauguration in the first place instead of having a bunch of, white guys go in the back room and sign a paper?
do you want to take this one, man?
You want that
Or I can.
You don't want that one?
So, so the inauguration, the great fanfare and the pomp and circumstance and the millions of people that flock into Washington, D.C., that is, like everything else in American history, that has grown over time. It started out as a very modest swearing in at Federal Hall in New York City when George Washington took the oath in 1789. A large crowd showed up because this was an historic moment in world history when this had happened. But George Washington, in many ways, set some precedents that day. He added some religious effects to it, when he added "So help me God" to the oath of office. That's not in the Constitution. When he put his hand on a Bible, that's not in the Constitution either. He gave the first inaugural speech. But over time, this just started to grow, and over the years, different elements were added: the parades, the moving to the Capitol, the front of the Capitol, the back of the Capitol, to just create this massive event that we have now. It just happened gradually.
Mary, we've all seen the logistics that go into putting on an inauguration, you know, year after year after year, and the wives have to sit here, and so has to sit here. But not all presidents have gone to their inauguration either married, and some of them have gone with children. What happened? Tell us some of what's happened with that over the
I
years.
want to talk about your grandfather's sister.
You go for it.
Her name was Rose Cleveland, and she was a remarkable woman. And she, because Grover Cleveland wasn't married, she was the first lady, right? And she was his hostess and all that kind of thing. And she said she would nod, shake hands, and she said, "You may see me smiling and saying hello, but in my mind, I'm conjugating Greek verbs to get over the monotony." Well, you have to know about Rose Cleveland. She was extremely well educated. She was a teacher in women's colleges. She wrote these books. And she actually wrote this book called George Eliot's Poetry and Other Studies. Now, George Eliot, anybody know George? Excuse me. George Eliot was the pen name, excuse me, the pen name of Marianne Evans. And she took this male name because she didn't want her novels to be viewed as some soppy Victorian claptrap. And it worked because her Middlemarch is considered the best novel in English history. Well, Rose's book is not just about George Eliot. It's chapters, and each chapter focuses on a woman who has stepped out of her comfort zone and done something remarkable. Joan of Arc, the wife of Muhammad, all the, and her books, not just that one, but everything she writes is about women stepping forward, being more, being greater, saying your truth, no matter if you're going to get slammed, and you're going to get slammed by the men at the time. But what her thing was so amazing is that nobody wrote about that kind of stuff now. Now we get join the army, be all you can be, and all the human, we're used to that now, but that was completely unknown at that time. So after she was released from her duties, when Grover Cleveland married Frances, they called her Frank, she took off for Europe, and she had this amazing life, just all this wonderful stuff that she did. She went into Italy and saw St. Augustine's statue, and she got really involved in St. Augustine's soliloquies, and she began to realize that the translators had done terrible stuff with his translations. It was bastardized and changed for people's purposes, religious purposes. And she thought, this is just ridiculous. And so she went and found an original version and translated the whole thing. And her book is still available now. And I bought one of them. It was just wonderful. Anyway, so she and her dear beloved friend, Evangeline Whipple, went to a place called Bagni di Lucca in Tuscany. And Bagni di Lucca is an amazing place. It's got all these villas right along the river. It's got a bridge that comes like this, and then when it reflects in the river, it's a perfect circle, and all kinds of famous people would go there to recuperate. Lord Byron, Shelley, even a czar of Russia, they would just all go there because it was such an amazing place. Well, her friend, Evangeline, had inherited tons of money from her first husband. She was a widow twice. And so she bought a villa there. And they moved in, and they also had another friend who was a very famous book illustrator. And then World War I hit. And all of a sudden, here's all these refugees coming down into Italy from all the horrible stuff that was going on, in World War I. And so they turned that villa into a place where the women could sew and earn money. They did a school for all these children that came down. They turned it in, they had a little hospital kind of thing, and they were really, really serving. And then World War I's over, and then the Spanish flu hits. And so they just are caring for all of these people, and Rose uses her she gets nooses and medical supplies and all that kind of stuff there because she's Rose Cleveland. And then they keep serving and caring for all of these patients, and then the book illustrator gets the flu, and 5 days later she's dying, and Rose picks her up like this, and it says in the that she breathed out the seeds of death into Rose's face. And Rose, 5 days later, died. And so Evangeline wrote back to the United States, and they put it all in the papers, how she died and how strong she was and what a blessing she was. And what happened in that village was that the mayor called for a whole day of silence, and the whole village and all of these refugees walked beside her coffin, and they put her in her grave, and they covered her with her favorite American flag, which was the very first American flag, with the 13 colonies and so forth. And then every one of those people went by and dropped flowers on top of her. Well, all that goes to tell you what a remarkable woman she was. But we go back to the 1885 inauguration, and the New York Times reported this. Miss Cleveland wore a dress of black satin with an entire overdress of Spanish lace. The satin bodice was cut low and sleeveless, and the transparent lace revealed the shoulders and the arms. Well,
Sounds like the red carpet at the Grammys.
yeah, it doesn't it? Yeah. So what happens was that one of the main suffragists got all bent out of shape because she thought she was showing too much skin, and Rose just wrote, "I approve of evening dress which shows necks and arms. I do not approve of any dress which shows the bust. Between the neck and the bust, there is a line always to be drawn, and it is as clear to the most frivolous society women as to the anatomists. This line need never be passed, and a fashionable woman's low-necked evening dress need never be immodest. If it is so, it is because she prefers it to be so." So after that, Rose Cleveland was like the de facto authority on the proper neckline for evening dresses.
Mary, thank you. Would love to see a copy of that dress at some point. Yeah. Larry, tell us a bit, you've certainly researched an awful lot of inaugural events, and what are some of the ones that stand out to you in your research?
Well, some of them that have gotten a lot of news lately with President Trump not attending Biden's inauguration, there was a lot of talk about had that ever happened before, and it really had happened before. Quite early on, John Adams did not attend Thomas Jefferson's inauguration. And going back to what Lewis was commenting on earlier with the whole inaugural thing, it's a great thing because it's symbolic for our nation, and Nicholas mentioned it at the introduction about the peaceful transfer of power with the person from out of the country talking to him. And so, when this was all in the news with President Trump not going to President Biden's inauguration, it was big news, but it really wasn't new news because it's happened a few other times. So, and then John Quincy Adams, he followed in his father's footsteps and did not go to Andrew Jackson's inauguration. And there was a lot of bad blood between the two with the campaign. Not to get into a long story, but Rachel, Andrew Jackson's wife, really took a lot of heat during that campaign, and she was in fragile health, and she died when he was president-elect. So that really caused a big rift between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And then Martin Van Buren did not attend William Henry Harrison's inauguration. And I think you might talk a little bit more later about William Henry Harrison, but not really clear why that didn't occur. But he wasn't there. And then we already talked about the Trump-Biden thing. So the last one here on the list with that would be Andrew Johnson not attending Ulysses Grant's inauguration. And again, there was a little bit of a rift between them, something about not riding together in the carriage to the inauguration, and Johnson got bent out of shape and stayed at the White House and continued to sign some legislation and do some other things. So it's really interesting as a historian, though, because you'll see the news come up and it's breaking news and big news, and most of what we hear has happened before in our history, and sometimes several times like this. And the other thing I just wanted to mention really quickly was when I mentioned about John Adams not going to Thomas Jefferson's, and maybe the reason why that is, you got to think that, Thomas Jefferson was John Adams' vice president. And then he ran against him and got the presidency. So I could see kind of where that would be a little bit hard to go to the inauguration, maybe. Whether that was really the reason, I don't know. But it's an interesting fact anyway. So, but my point is, when you listen to the news and it's breaking news, check history and see if it's happened before, because it probably has.
If I could just add to that, too. Because you had asked why this isn't just held in some back room, why this is such public fanfare. Some people may forget 240 years later how significant it is to have a leader that is elected by the people. This is something that hadn't happened before in such a large company or in such a large country in world history before. So this is really something, the people's leader, for the people to be there and to celebrate. This hadn't happened in the monarchs and the dictatorships of Europe or other areas of the world. And even though John Adams didn't attend Thomas Jefferson's inauguration, that was the first bloodless transfer of power in world history, perhaps, where it went from one political party, because John Adams, George Washington were both Federalists. Thomas Jefferson was the first opponent political party from the Democrat-Republican Party. That was the first time in world history that there was ever a peaceful transfer of power without bloodshed.
Scared all the kings and emperors to death.
Yep. Yeah, because they just figured, all right, that the U.S. won the revolution. They're not going to last too long. Give them some time. They're going to crack, and we'll just go in there and pick up the pieces. We'll just make them vassal states or something. So we take this for granted. Many people take this for granted now. How significant this is, a peaceful, and maybe this last one wasn't that peaceful, but still, it's peaceful if you look at it in world history perspective. The peaceful transfer of power, how significant that is, and how blessed we are to have this.
Louis, Larry had mentioned the Harrison inauguration. Both Harrison inaugurations were pretty interesting, and why don't you let go on that, because they're fairly famed.
Yeah, so William Henry Harrison was elected our 8th president. Our 9th president. So William Henry Harrison was running in 1841 on his war record from 1812. So he was pretty up in years. He was 68 years old when he was running to be the president, and many people felt that he was too old for the job. They actually said he should just go to his log cabin and drink hard cider. So his campaign manager said, hey, let's twist that around. Let's turn you into the people's president, where you're just going to be there in your log cabin drinking hard cider. And they set up campaign events where they'd have log cabins and give out hard cider, get people drunk. So he wanted to prove that vitality on Inauguration Day. So it was a cold, snowy day in Washington, D.C., but President-elect Harrison wanted to prove that he was up for the job, so he didn't wear his overcoat, didn't wear his top hat, didn't ride by carriage. He ended up riding his horse like a triumphant general to the Capitol to take the oath of office, stood there and gave his speech. He spoke for 1 hour, paused, took the oath of office, and then spoke for 1 more hour, all with no hat on, all out there in the snow and rain. So lo and behold, President Harrison goes back to the White House, starts feeling sick. 31 days later, President Harrison dies from pneumonia and becomes the shortest term president in American history. So it shows that these inauguration events can be dangerous for some too.
I just wanted to comment one thing. I love that about the hard cider thing and how they turned that. I think that was one of the first really clever political moves to do, because they just made him look like one of the people, and it turned on Martin Van Buren to make him look like this uppity dandy. And so I just, yeah, which he was. But it really highlighted it, and I think that was just such a good political move that it really intrigues me, and I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and they say that he turned electioneering into a sport, and he brought that sort of enthusiasm into the inauguration too. The first inaugural parade was held in 1841, so the first parade floats, we hadn't seen that before. So that started in 1841 as well.
Larry, what other magic moments stick out for you in our inaugural history? I mean, there's so many little fun anecdotes that we could go on, forever. I know that one of my favorites was always, I guess it was Bush 1, his inauguration, and Barbara Bush broke a line to went over and give Willard Scott a big hug, who was standing on the sidelines. That was always one of my favorite things. But there's so many little pieces that go on, stuff that we'll probably never know till the end of time. But what are some of the anecdotes that?
Well, one that really sticks out with me, and for personal reasons with President Carter, is his inauguration and a couple of things there. The first thing he said when he got up to the podium is he thanked Gerald Ford, and that was a really gracious moment. And you talk about peaceful transition of power. He thanked Gerald Ford, and they became great friends. And I think that was the beginning of it after a campaign. And he said that. And a little offshoot on that story that I would like to tell. I interviewed President Carter a couple of years ago, and I talked to him about his friendship with Gerald Ford, and he said, well, let me tell you a little story. And he said, one day Jerry called me and said, Jimmy, I have a favor to ask you. And President Carter said, sure, Jerry, anything. And he said, well, I'd like you to give the eulogy at my funeral. And President Carter told me, he said, I was really taken aback when he asked me that, and I really didn't know what to say. So he said, I finally said, sure, Jerry, it's a deal. I'll do the one at your funeral if you promise to do the one at mine. And I just thought that was great, and that comes back to the inauguration, where I think that started that friendship right there with that first line. And then the other thing with his inauguration is that he quoted his school teacher in that. And I know Jan will love that I mentioned that with the school teacher, Miss Julia Coleman, who was just a major influence on his life. You know, people go to Plains, Georgia, and they say, how did a guy from a little town like this become president of the United States? And you go to Plains, Georgia, and you get to know the people there, and you get to know the history. And I told President Carter this. I said, my response to that is, how didn't you become president of the United States? Because he had such influence there, and Julia Coleman was a remarkable, remarkable teacher that influenced him and changed history because she was a big part of him becoming president of the United States. And he's the only president to have quoted his school teacher or a school teacher in his inaugural speech. So those are two that really have meaning to me personally and really stand out a lot.
Mary, do you have favorites beyond the Rose Cleveland
I've got
in
a
her
real
outfit?
short one that you're going to love. This is Marie Clinton Bruno, our Marie Clinton Bruno. Are you here, Marie? There she is over there. She's at Bill Clinton. She and her family are at Bill Clinton's inauguration. They're sitting in the stands with all their family around them, cold as kraut. And here comes Bill Clinton walking along, and she goes, "Hi, Cousin Billy!" And then they just laugh, and Bill Clinton turns around and goes, he says, they just love being yokels. And all the people are going, who are these people?
You've always been a shrinking violet, so we're not surprised. Another interesting piece of inaugural history is Grover Cleveland was the first president that we know of to ever appear on film. And there are two instances of this. One is in a really poor newsreel of William McKinley's inauguration. It was McKinley's inauguration, but the film was taken before he was inaugurated, so that made Grover the first president to ever appear on film. It's a really grainy, Grover just kind of, you know, you have to kind of close your eyes, but you know that that's Grover. And it always seemed bizarre to me that even though Grover Cleveland was president as long ago as he was, that there was technology that should have been able to capture a moving image. And just as kind of an aside, I've recently discovered that there was a semi-comedy documentary made in 1894 or 5 called, of course it just went out of my head, I think it was called A Capital Day, something to that effect, a silent film obviously. And no one has ever seen this. And I'm one of those people who believes that there are still dodos somewhere, you know, that nothing is gone forever. And I had occasion last fall to do a program with Susan Lloyd, who is the granddaughter of Harold Lloyd, the silent film actor, and she's very much involved in restoration and finding films. So we are on the hunt for that movie, and I hope that next year at the Cherry Blossom Festival, we know that we're going to be able to actually see that. And the world premiere. I mean, after all, it would be fitting to do that here. Louis, some other anecdotes that, because I know you guys got tons of them. We could do this forever. We're not going to, but we could.
Yeah. So one that sticks out in my mind was in 1985 at Ronald Reagan's inauguration. So actually, let me preface this, is that the inauguration date is now set in the Constitution as January 20th. But throughout history, if January 20th falls on a Sunday, normally the inauguration will then get moved to a Monday. But the swearing in and the inauguration are sometimes two separate events. So in past history, the swearing in would also get bumped to that Monday. But in modern history, what happens is that the swearing in will take place in private on Sunday, and then the massive festivities will then get moved to a Monday. So on January 20th, 1985, was the swearing in, and then the inauguration was moved to Monday. But that January 20th also happened to be Super Bowl Sunday. So after Ronald Reagan took the oath of office, he then went to a room in the White House and remotely flipped the coin to start the Super Bowl, which was the 49ers and the Dolphins. So I thought that was really cool that that took place on the same day. First he got sworn in, then he flipped the coin. And there's some great YouTube footage of it too. It's about 10 minutes where they're prepping Reagan and he's making jokes about it. And then finally he flips the coin and that's it. The actual flip takes like 3 seconds. But it's really fascinating that it took place on the same day.
We've seemed to have lacked over the last, I know, couple of decades, a lot of the wonderful, pomp and circumstance, which a lot of people think is just that, pomp and circumstance. Who needs it? It's fun. And it kind of, it holds events into a certain reverence, especially when you're dealing with heads of state. Transition, I'm thinking of state dinners as well as the inaugurations. And I think if there's a sound to an inauguration, or the arrival of president at any time, it's ruffles and flourishes. And can any of you elucidate how we got ruffles and flourishes and hail to the chief? I remember that when I was at Obama's, I think the Republicans set up the field where the spectators were, because there was the Jumbotron. You're so far away. I mean, I was almost in North Carolina watching the thing. They set up a Jumbotron television set right behind a tree, so you couldn't possibly see it unless you were like in the tree. It killed. But they'd have the little caption that would come up and go ruffles and flourishes, and then off in the distance you can hear it. So ruffles
so I can
and flourishes.
take that one. Yeah.
You take it away.
And that's actually my cell phone ring too, so it happens to go off.
That's
So hail to the chief is. So
That's
yeah.
awfully humble of you.
So this goes back to 1841. This goes back to William Henry Harrison, because the Constitution is very vague on what happens when a president dies. For some reason, the founders in Philadelphia, sitting there for those weeks on end, never really thought that a president would die in office. So when this happened, it wasn't clear who would become the president. So John Tyler was the vice president, and there was discussions about whether he should be considered an acting vice president or whether there should be another election. So nobody really knew what to do. But John Tyler just immediately began calling himself president. He said, I took the oath of office already as vice president. The Constitution, my reading of the Constitution, means that I am now president. And if any mail came to acting vice president, he would just throw it away, wouldn't answer the mail. Later on, to continue to emphasize that legitimacy, his wife had added, which was actually towards the end of his administration, around 1845, she had demanded that every time President John Tyler walked in the room, that the Marine Band would kick off and play Hail to the Chief. So that's the first time that Hail to the Chief became synonymous with the entrance of a president, with the flourishes. I did look up the inauguration of James K. Polk, who became president after John Tyler, to see if Hail to the Chief was played at his inauguration. I didn't see any evidence that it was, so maybe it was. So I'm not sure the first inauguration where it was played, but that's where the tradition began with John Tyler of Hail to the Chief.
I don't recall hearing of it being played with anything associated with Cleveland either. So,
okay.
But I mean, it's a catchy tune.
It is.
With the pomp and circumstance, George, I'd like to point out on the one piece of memorabilia we have up here, right there, you've got incoming President JFK with President Eisenhower, and they're both wearing the top hats there. And from everything I know of with Kennedy, he wasn't a hat guy. So, I could just, I'm amused every time I look at that photo because I could just picture JFK going, I got to put this on,
Mess up my hair.
But yes, exactly, and which something I never worry about. Right. But at any rate, he looks good in it, and I love that photo. But I just wanted to point out that's part of the pomp and circumstance there with the wearing the top hats.
It said that Kennedy killed the hat business.
Yeah.
Because, some people said my grandmother killed the bustle business because she wouldn't wear a bustle on her dress, which there's some dispute about. We are beginning to wend our way to the end of this. And we want to make sure that we're able to leave time if any of you all have any questions at all. And let her rip. I don't know what you want to do about the sound on the question. Oh, there we go. You know, everybody's been referring to all the nice people running around with the microphones as the Phil Donahues, and I'm sure half the people here don't know who Phil Donahue is. But he must have run 20 miles a day on his TV show.
I got one more, if you don't
Yes,
mind.
I don't mind, if you don't mind.
I don't mind. And this is about when Harding died. He was in office, of course, and that meant that Calvin Coolidge was going to be president. And he was not in D.C., and his father had to do the oath of office in the middle of the night. Well, the next day, when it hit the news and all that, the boys, his two sons, Calvin and John, Calvin was working on a farm in Massachusetts, and he was earning $3.50 a day. And when his employer brought the news, Calvin just said, yeah, I suppose my father is President Calvin Coolidge now. In which one of these sheds do you want me to work this morning, Mr. Day? And then later, another worker told him, it says, well, if my father was president, I wouldn't work in a tobacco field. And this one's Calvin says, if my father were your father, you would.
Question. I got.
When was the first automobiles used in the inauguration, and they actually used automobiles
There you go.
for transporting the president up to the stands?
Was it TR?
Yeah, I'm not sure. That's a good question. It
I would
might be
guess,
Teddy
I would
Roosevelt.
guess Teddy Roosevelt. I'm not 100% sure either, but,
Actually, I'm sorry. It's Harding. It was Harding. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Just
Okay.
glanced down at some notes that I took. Yeah.
Cool.
So yeah, sometimes it's always that balance of like of new technology, tradition, and also bringing in what the president wants to do. So it did take some time because automobiles were around for 20 years by this point. But Warren G. Harding was the first one to actually ride in a car. And actually, it was interesting. Warren G. Harding was also the first one to use a sophisticated microphone too. So when he spoke. So in the past, when these great speeches were given by Lincoln and by Washington and by Grover Cleveland, no one can really hear them unless you're in the front row or so. They'd read it in the paper the next day. But with Warren G. Harding, whatever he said that day, everyone can hear it in the crowd.
Marie.
Mine's more of a comment than a question. Just how many people
Could
here have been to
little-
an inaugural?
Say that again.
How many people have been to a presidential inauguration? Okay.
Have been?
Yes. I don't know if you all will join me in this, but if you've never been and have the time, no matter the candidate, if you have to stay in Virginia, if you are under the Jumbotron, you are really part of it. That was one of the things, not only the family stuff that we did, but it is worth it for your kids, and there's so much going on, and you really feel you are part of history. It's worth the trip, and bundle up, don't wear high heels, wear jeans, don't get fancy because you'll be walking, but I highly recommend a trip if your kids are older to go to DC and be part of it. I think, Louis.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add to that. I've been to two of them. So I've been to Barack Obama's in 2013 and President Trump's in 2017. And it doesn't matter what political party you are. Don't just go for your guy. But it's just such a great event to be at. And both times, there's just some images that I took. Here's President Obama. Whoa. And then there's President Trump. These are just pictures that I took. It's just so great. You can get so close to the action there. It's just such a great, chilling event, and it doesn't matter what party it is.
And part of the beauty of understanding history is in the tradition. Because when you're standing there watching something that has happened regularly for 200 and some years, you know that you are part of something that is continuing. That is living history. And it's a way for us to touch and feel and be more part of. And it's something that we just continue to get away from more and more and more. And I'm not going to get completely on my soapbox about there is no H in STEM, but you know, studying and learning history is so important because, as you found out this weekend, it's fun. You've got these amazing historians here. You have a panel yesterday where you've got a descendant of the Confederate President of the United States and the commander of the Union Army. Where does that happen? When was the last time you saw that? That just doesn't happen. I tell people that, and they go slack-jawed. And I know, Burton's heard me tell this story a million times, that I spoke at the New York National History Day finals a few years back, and I had just come back from Marshfield, and I was explaining them, 500 kids in a room from the state of New York who are finalists for National History Day, essays and various other presentations. And I said, oh, I've got a picture of a direct descendant of Jefferson Davis with his arm around a direct descendant of Dred Scott. And, in some places, everybody would have just said, who? Those kids, you could hear them audibly gasp. It was one of the most wonderful things, and it's the thing that continues to give me hope. And that's why people like us and people like you have got to keep spreading the word. Go to inaugurations, go to things, enjoy the pomp and circumstances. Roll your eyes if you must, but soak it in. Yeah. Any other questions from anyone?
Yes.
Yes.
I collect a great many encyclopedias of presidents, and it's amazing how many different versions of stories. The Hail to the Chief story is often attributed to Sarah Polk. The Polks were Scottish Presbyterians, and Hail to the Chief is a Scottish song. And Mr. Polk was so thin, so small, that very often when he walked into the room, nobody would know that the president was present. So she had inaugurated it. A fact about John Tyler, they list the children that presidents have. They said that he had 162. He was a slave owner. With Calvin Coolidge, a Will Rogers story, Mr. Rogers goes to the White House, the president sticks out his hand and says, Calvin Coolidge. Rogers replies, excuse me, I didn't quite catch the last name. With Kennedy in the hat, it looked very unusual and almost improper to me. Jackie was very uncomfortable, but never forgot that when Mamie saw Ike put on that high hat, she turned to Jackie, who she had a very uncomfortable relationship, huge age difference, and she said, look at that, Ike looks just like Paddy the Irishman.
One more question. Two more over there.
We got to go to Washington, D.C. in '85.
Can you speak up just a hair?
Yes. Our school band from Willard, Missouri got to go to be in the parade.
Yes.
I went with B.J. Marsh, and it was, I'm thinking it's going to be cold, and I didn't even have a big, heavy coat, so I borrowed a coat from a friend. It was so hot that I sat on the coat on the, sidewalk.
Better than being too cold.
I was just going to add to that. We were there as spectators with the band, and we were lining Pennsylvania Avenue, and they had us clear away from all the manholes. And before it started, they checked every manhole for bombs. Yeah. And then the side of the sidewalk that was going to be viewed by the media, we all got flags on our side, and the other side of the street did not get flags.
Yeah, security's very tight there. You mentioned about the bomb, yeah. Just to the National Mall, you need to go through metal detectors. Oh my goodness. Are we being attacked?
I think it's her.
The question is, was there an inauguration that was perhaps over the top in elaborateness as compared to others?
I can't think of one because everyone kind of gets a little bigger, gets a little bigger, gets a little bigger. So I can't think of any giant leap besides William Henry Harrison, and I feel like every answer that I'm giving is William Henry Harrison. But that was the first inaugural parade. That was the first time there was floats, so that would have just seemed so out of place compared to 1837. But then over the years, they kept adding touches. They kept adding the ceremonial ride from the White House to the Capitol, and they added the bands, and they added more people of the cloth on the stage, and they added the poet laureate. So this year's poet, Amanda Gorman, was, I think, perhaps the most memorable feature of the Biden inauguration. That was only added, I believe, by John F. Kennedy. So every one kind of gets like a little bigger, a little bigger, a little bigger, and it's like so gradual. You think it's always been that way, but if you look back a couple, like, wow, this got big, and then look back a couple more. So yeah, it's just been this gradual growth.
I agree with that answer too. That's exactly what I would say, because at the time you think yours is the most elaborate one, and then they're elaborate in different ways too, like he said, in different aspects, more elaborate. So yeah, I think that's a great answer.
Yes, one more. Was there ever a time a Bible was not used?
Yes. No, go ahead, but I know of a couple times, but go ahead.
Go ahead, because I'm thinking of a couple, but I can't remember the names.
I believe John Quincy Adams did not use one, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I believe Franklin Pierce did not use a Bible.
Because he was drunk.
And I don't know about that. I don't think he was.
Poor Franklin.
Yeah, poor Franklin. And I want to say there was at least one other one. Is there any that I'm missing that you know of?
No, I believe there might have been, but I know Franklin Pierce and John Quincy Adams
Yeah.
didn't. Yeah, and that's not in the Constitution anywhere. Again, George Washington just created it.
I got to tell you a quickie Bible story. I went to the Library of Congress a couple of years ago because our family decided to donate, well, we didn't really donate it, to have the Library of Congress acquire the Cleveland Inaugural Bible. It's the only Bible that was ever used at both inaugurations of one particular president. But we were in a room with the curator of rare books at the Library of Congress, which is a heady place to be. He had brought this show and tell stuff for my family. And one of the things he had was Lincoln's inaugural Bible. It's been used by several presidents. And I wish I had given a picture. It's Lincoln forgot the Bible when he went to be inaugurated. So he sent somebody out to whatever the equivalent of Barnes and Noble was to quickly, to grab a Bible. And it's red velvet with like copper fixings on it, and it is so beautifully worn. You just know that how much that book meant to that man. It was and they let us hold it, which was even cooler. So I want to thank you all very, very much for coming to. Louis, we got to go. Jamie, we're on a time thing here. Stay tuned for Louis. You're coming up next to talk about Grant's tomb. And again, thank you all very much. It's a full day. Thank you for coming, and enjoy the rest of your morning.